Welcome. Thank you for joining us for Where We're Going. This series from ThinkND explores this point in time and how the work happening through Notre Dame's campus relates to and impacts the US and the world at large. My name is Mary Scott, and I'm the Alumni Education Programs Director here at the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Today, we're talking about privacy, and our guest speakers are Notre Dame faculty who will share their work with us. If you have any questions for our guest speakers, please use the Google form that we're sharing with you now. And now I'd like to welcome our moderator for today's discussion, our colleague and friend, Mark McKenna. Mark is a 1997 graduate of Notre Dame. He's also the John P. Murphy Foundation Professor of Law at the Notre Dame Law School and the Director of the Notre Dame Technology Ethics Center. The new Technology Ethics Center is dedicated to interdisciplinary research on the impact of technology on humanity. The center convenes global thought leaders across academia, industry, nonprofit organizations, and governmental agencies. The Tech Ethics Center is actually going to be hosting one of its conferences tomorrow here on ThinkND on algorithmic bias. Mark, I understand that everyone's welcome to join us tomorrow. Can you tell us a little bit about the center's work and specifically the conference that you're hosting tomorrow?
Sure, Mary. Yeah, thanks for having me. So the Technology Ethics Center is a major new university initiative that brings together scholars from a really wide range of disciplines across campus, all of whom study technology ethics from some perspective. So we've got faculty affiliated with the center from computer science to philosophy to law and business and even in the public policy areas. The animating idea of the center is that technology ethics problems are complex ones that require consideration of technical, social, and ethical and policy responses. So they're kind of things that no one discipline has a monopoly on. So we really need to bring together people from lots of different areas to try to make progress. We're trying to bring people together who share the idea that technology ought to serve human ends. That's sort of the kind of animating goal of the center. So first and foremost, ND Tech is a research organization, meaning we're trying to really produce world-class academic research. But we've also recently partnered with IBM to create something that I think is really unique, which is what we're calling the Notre Dame IBM Technology Ethics Lab. And that lab is intended to be the primary vehicle through which the center and the university engages with industry, with government, and other kinds of policy organizations about technology ethics, so that the work we do has a chance to have a real impact in a sort of practical sense in the world. And as you mentioned, we're hosting a really great virtual conference tomorrow, Friday, from noon to 3. That conference focuses on algorithmic bias, as you mentioned, focusing really on its sources and possible policy responses. You can find information about that conference on our website at techethics.nd.edu in the events section, and or on ThinkND, where we've included all the panelists, speakers, and their bios. So I hope everybody here will join us for that.
Thank you.
So today's event is, as Mary mentioned, the first in a 3-part series on privacy. In an ever-increasing data-driven world, privacy considerations have grown ever more complicated and important. This series is intended to highlight faculty research on privacy issues, the context in which distinguished practitioners encounter privacy in their various roles. So we'll have practitioners who work in industry and government and in public policy. And then the international dimensions, especially because privacy has taken on such importance in a world of global data transfers. So our first conversation is going to focus on our campus community. Privacy's increasing importance is really reflected, I think, in the outstanding research of many of our faculty colleagues working on this problem in a variety of disciplines, from law to business and computer science. This conversation is going to introduce our participants to some of that research with a particular emphasis on understanding what privacy is, what kind of interests are at stake, what context it's implicated, what kind of harms we should be concerned about. And one of the reasons that's important is I think persistent uncertainty or even disagreement about kind of foundational privacy questions make policy development in this area very hard. So what I hope today that we'll do is explore some possible explanations for that disagreement and think about where we could go from there. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to detail each of the panelists' impressive bios. You can see them on the ThinkND page, and they've already been emailed to all the participants. But I will quickly introduce them. First is Corey Angst, who's professor of Information, Technology, Analytics, and Operations in the Mendoza College of Business. And then it's Kirsten Martin, who's professor of Information Technology, Analytics, and Operations, and also the William P. and Hazel B. White Center Professor of Technology Ethics. And finally, Ann Tenbrunsel, who's the David E. Gallo Professor of Business Ethics in the Mendoza College of Business. So welcome to Corey, Kirsten, and Ann. We're delighted that all of you guys could join us today.
Thank you.
As I mentioned earlier, this is the first program in a 3-part series on privacy. And so what I'm hoping we could do to start today is just talk a little bit with each of you about your research and about what privacy is. So Corey, I'll start with you. Some of your research focuses on what you describe as privacy of information. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little about what privacy means to you in a research context.
Yeah, so the way I want to think about this, or have everyone think about it, is privacy is different to just about everyone that you ask. And it's a multidimensional construct, which makes it really interesting for us to study, but also kind of complicated too, because it differs by individual. In particular, I'll give you an example. I might be perfectly comfortable sharing my my medical information, my private medical information with my doctor. I might also be happy to share certain information with the ESPN website that I'm very fond of. We call that collection of information. And of course, it varies depending on who you are about that. But back to the hospital example, I might be entirely uncomfortable with the hospital selling my information to a data aggregator. That's something that we call in research secondary use or unauthorized access. And those are the differences there, sort of highlight the fact that privacy is not just one thing. And in fact, it even goes deeper than that. We have something that we call the privacy calculus, but in really simple terms, what this means is I'm asking myself the question, how much privacy am I willing to give up in exchange for something else? So I'll stop there and allow Mark to ask the next question.
Okay, great. That's actually, I think, a really good segue to, I think, one of the research projects that you and Ann have been working on, focusing on informed consent in the medical care context. Ann, would you describe some of that work for us?
Sure. So Corey and I, along with my postdoc, Nate Michaels, and Chris Adkins, who's the executive director of Notre Dame's Deloitte Center of Ethical Leadership, have begun a study of perceived ethicality of medical consent forms. And this was really born out of the initiative put out by the Health and Wellbeing Initiative, where they put out a call for proposals to Notre Dame faculty. I'm sure Corey shares this. We were quite grateful to be one of the 4 recipients out of maybe 90 plus proposals that were submitted. And what the focus of our project is, again, is on perceived ethicality of these medical consent forms. For the purposes of our study, we have focused on what's known as the NPP, or the Notice of Privacy Practices. I'm pretty sure everybody in the audience has seen one and has signed one, maybe way more than you imagine, but it's also quite likely that you don't remember doing that and that you have any idea what information is on it. So there's been a lot of research investigating, do people recall these? Do they comprehend what they're sending? This is the form that you get, say, for example, that you have to okay before you maybe see your doctor. Most people don't read it, so recall tends to be low, comprehension is low. Research is focused on that. It's also focused on factors that influence whether you're willing to share. But in reality, close to 100% of people share their information. They click yes on that box. That's due to a variety of reasons. It's really hard to say no. If you haven't tried it, you might want to and see if you actually can say no. You really just see it as a gate to get in to see your doctor. Maybe you're in a lot of time pressure or a sense of urgency. So people sign it. But what our team said is, but is it ethical? Do people think it's ethical? They may really felt that they had no choice to sign it, but do they perceive that this is ethical? And so that's really what we have started out to investigate.
Yeah, just actually yesterday I was at the doctor's office and I was offered this privacy thing, but actually all they really offered me was a little electronic pad where I was asked to sign something that I didn't even see. It wasn't, and I said, well, like, what am I signing? And they said, well, I guess we can get it for you if you want. But they were literally just asking for my signature on that. So what did you guys do to study this?
So we started out just trying to get a lay of the research domain, interviewing 17 or so senior officials at healthcare institutions, narrowing our topic to the one that I just described. We then looked at about 25 actual NPP statements and selected those statements that seemed most relevant to our focus on privacy and perceived ethicality.
I was just going to ask you, what have you guys seen so far?
Well, I think since February, we've run it 16 times. We had a bunch of other trials before then. So we have about 7,500 respondents to date. And one of the things we've seen is that it differs by just the statement itself. So statements that are rated high in ethicality, for example, might be a statement that says, we may use or disclose your protected health information when we are permitted to do so by law. Or we can use or share your information for health research. So depending on, am I allowed to do it legally, maybe who's using it and for what? So if you look at the reverse of that, those that were rated low, we may use your protected health information to contact you in order to raise funds for our benefit. People perceive that to be significantly less ethical, as did they using information for government functions, things like military, national security, and presidential protective services. So the statements itself vary significantly. And if you look at those differences, again, it's really who's using the data. Is it internal? Is it my doctor? Is it for health reasons? And what's the scope of using it? Is it for your benefit, or is it maybe for more of a societal benefit?
Importantly, these are all statements that came from actual NPPs. And we've seen some really surprising things in those. One example is that you can request that your information be taken out of a research pool, but we don't have to honor that request. That's literally the way it's worded in the document.
So I wonder, I think you guys started this study in pre-COVID times, if we could even remember back that far. I wonder if you've seen any differences, in the data you were collecting prior to or since COVID. Any impact there?
Yeah, we found ourselves kind of in a situation where we'd already collected data, kind of pre-COVID and now during COVID, and saw that as somewhat of a unique opportunity to see, do ethicality concerns change during that time? And so we, for example, comparing a study we did in February, beginning of February, which we think of as pre-COVID, where it probably wasn't top of mind for most people, and comparing that to May. Surprising, I think, to us, Corey, was that ratings of ethicality went up. So suddenly everybody saw it as more ethical. So we do see divisions by age. For example, older people see it as more unethical. Females see it as more unethical. Liberals see it as more unethical. Conservatives see it as more ethical. But every group rose pre and post COVID. So it wasn't concentrated in a particular area. It was simply that suddenly everybody's like, yeah, I'm okay with this. And I think in retrospect, and Corey, you can chime in, this isn't as surprising now, because what we know from other literature is when there's an external threat, like a pandemic, we become more cohesive as a group. And so collective responsibility can certainly become more salient. And so I think the one explanation is it's okay if you collect this data, if you help mitigate, in some sense, the societal risk.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add one minor point to that, and that's that we also were collecting the things that I mentioned very early on, these different components of what we call concern for information privacy, and we saw much less variation there. So the ethicality statements, there's quite a lot of variation as a result of COVID, but your concerns are pretty stable. We think that in itself is an interesting phenomena that we need to dig deeper into.
And I think in part because, at least to my knowledge, the privacy literature is focused mostly on, although Kirsten's work is certainly different, on those concerns for privacy versus ethicality, which one at maybe first glance would think that they're the same. But as Corey mentioned, they seem to kind of respond differently.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting too, to me, if you think that people are okay with it, to make it simple right now, more than they were, say, back in February. But yet there's all other discussions that saying privacy concerns should really be heightened because of all the data, extra data that's being collected to try and mitigate the pandemic. And I think the story remains is, will those concerns change again once we no longer feel this threat? And now suddenly everybody becomes worried about the data that was collected right now.
Great. So, all right, Kirsten, I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to ask you if you might talk a little bit about the study you did that was focused on privacy expectations and location data. I know that actually had some sort of early COVID potential implications too. Can you maybe just talk to begin with, like what location data is and what you found?
Yeah, that's it. Thanks, Mark. So I did a series of studies with Professor Helen Niesemam. She's a philosopher in Cornell that does a lot of work on what is privacy and justifications around privacy. And the last one that we did was around location data. What are people's privacy expectations around location data that would seemingly, in our common parlance, be considered public? And so this would be, first, it's a good question about what is location data. So before we could actually go forward with actually using the word location, we did a pre-study to understand when we say the word location, what does that mean to people? What do they think that is? And what we found is that they equate it with GPS location. So when you use the word, if a company uses the word, we are going to gather your location data, consumers assume you mean GPS location. They don't assume you mean city or census block or street address. They think that you're pinpointing where they are exactly. So when it comes to location data, we did a study where we would situate the word location and ask whether or not certain actors or people or companies gathered your data. So this varied from the FBI to your family, to your workplace, to Yelp, to a social networking site. We also varied how the location data was gathered, whether it was through your phone, GPS tracker, license plate reader, facial recognition, CCTV. So there were all sorts of different mechanisms and ways to locate where you are. And then we asked about, and we layered this on together to make almost a little vignette. So did the FBI gather your information through Bluetooth sniffing and used it to figure out if you were at a protest at the National Mall? So we layered each one on, who gathered it, how it was gathered, and then what could they tell about you? Were you at the National Mall at a protest? Were you at a restaurant with friends and family? Were you at work on time? And we did find some interesting findings. I would say in general, there was only a few instances where actually the collection of location data met their privacy expectations in that it was positive at all. And that were things like your family figuring out if you were at a restaurant, or you're even in your employer figuring out if you were at work. Almost every other scenario that we offered was negative on meeting privacy expectations. They did differentiate a lot as to who gathered the data. So the FBI was actually more appropriate to gather your data. We're assuming the consumer was assuming that they had a warrant. So that's why they thought that the FBI was okay to gather your location data. They never liked when the data aggregator, if the actor collecting the data was a data aggregator, they immediately said it was the lowest score possible, no matter what information was gathered about them, how it was used, anything. Which I've run into data aggregators at conferences and they're always slightly shocked at this, that people don't trust that information is being gathered by them, but it's because we don't know who they are or what they're doing with the data. The interesting thing, so one was data aggregators being particularly untrustworthy in the eyes of users. The other thing was people didn't care or differentiate between how things were being gathered. And the reason this is important to companies is that sometimes companies will ask us in those notices that Corey and Ann mentioned, whether or not it's okay to gather your location data from the GPS locator on your phone. And you can actually, on some apps, click no, that's not okay. And then the company will then get your location data in another way. So through your Bluetooth location, or maybe through social network sites or from a location data aggregator. And what our study found was that when people tell you no on location data, they don't care how you gather it. They mean no in general. So they're not differentiating, we're okay with you gathering it through GPS, but not through CCTV. They're actually saying, we don't want our location data being gathered by you at all. And so I think we designed a study a couple years ago, but now we know from a few reporters that there's a lot of location data aggregators out there. And so it's interesting to see how actually more nuanced people are about who can get their data and how it should be used. they don't say no to all of it. They're pretty specific when you ask them nuanced questions about who gathers it and how it's used.
Yeah, that's great. So one piece I just want to follow up on there. So at the beginning of my privacy class, I always sort of ask students a whole series of questions about things just to sort of gauge their impulses about privacy. And one thing that I've been struck by recently is so much, I mean, as you know, so much of the sort of regulatory system of privacy differentiates between whether the information is being gathered somehow by the government, which mostly legal doctrine treats as that's the thing you should be concerned about, is when it's gathered by the government. And when it's gathered by private entities, fine, right? Because the government can put you in jail and the private entities can't. But the impulses of my students all the time when I ask them is exactly the opposite of that, which is they're much less trusting of the private entities, precisely because I think they don't know what's being done with that information. So that's a really interesting finding, I think.
Yeah,
I
think,
sorry.
I was just going to say, and it's interesting because that's actually being melded together, because for a while, about a decade, the federal government could actually go to those third parties, right, and just get it even without a subpoena, almost just ask Google for all of your information and they would hand it over. Not to pick on Google, they all would. And now there's a lot more scrutiny over that, and even court cases that are holding these third-party commercial data aggregators or companies to a higher standard as to what they do with the data, which is interesting to see that kind of melding together.
Yeah, great. I also wanted to ask you a little bit about your studies on privacy notices, and particularly whether the use of those notices engenders trust. I think this connects pretty nicely to Corey and Anne's project. So I thought maybe I'd ask you about that a little bit, and then if you could think or reflect a little bit on how you think it connects to the project they're working on.
Yeah, sure. I do think it connects. It was interesting. I've talked to Corey about, and also Chris Adkins and Anne about their study. I've done two that I can think of that are pertain to this. One was I found what people assume are in privacy notices. So I would offer them different scenarios and ask if it was actually conformed to the privacy notice or not. And what I found, and I used an actual privacy notice, I just changed out the company's name so that it would actually be realistic. And what I found through a series of studies is that people assume that their privacy expectations are met in the notice, that these notices are so ambiguous and so wordy we don't even read them. That people, if you ask them if something meets their privacy expectations and if it conforms to the notice, they actually equate the two things together. They just assume that their privacy expectations are being met in the notice, like almost as if the notice is a blank slate. And I think that has to do with a different, maybe it's the same study, but a different study I think that Corey's mentioned to me at least was about the different types of wording that people use in notices. The more ambiguous to a consumer, the better, because they can assume that their privacy expectations are being met. So the companies are actually feeding into our inability to read or understand these notices and making them purposely ambiguous, because then we will project our wants and desires onto them and assume that everything's okay because we want that app or we want to go on that website. And to show how hard it is to read these notices, I went to a professor at NYU Law School who does work on adhesion contracts and contracts, who did stuff on notices. And I said, what's the worst notice ever? She gave me the name of the worst notice ever. She also said that she hired 4 law students to go through these notices and explain what each of the sentences mean. And there was a significant number of sentences that the law students, the third-year law students, could not agree what the sentences meant. And I said, that's so interesting because we expect consumers to understand them. I would hope that law students that you're paying could figure this out, but they just, even with a good faith effort, couldn't figure out the notices. And so I do think that that goes towards the ambiguity and the fact that we just assume when we go to the doctor's office that our privacy expectations will be met. And so we click OK and go on through. I also did a different study where even evoking a privacy notice, using the formality of a company saying, but this conforms to our privacy notice, actually made people trust the company less. So it was subtle, but it was significant. And at first I didn't understand it. And then a few people that study contracts explained that more formal contracts can be a signal of a lack of trust. And so the more informal of we aim to meet your privacy expectations, or this met your privacy expectations, or the norms of the community, that actually engenders trust. If you start evoking or using formality of a notice, it actually decreases the trust of the consumers, which I just think is an interesting, every time we talk about notices, we should just realize that consumers don't like talking about notices because they don't like that formality.
Yeah, so one thing I really like about this conversation is the way you guys are all trying to actually learn how people understand what's really being presented to them. So as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about like how we regulate activities related to privacy, I'm I'm often really struck by how little consensus we seem to have about that. We have a really hard time coming up with the rules, often because we have a hard time agreeing about what the values are. Like, what do people really care about in privacy? What are they worried about happening to them? What kind of interests are we trying to protect? So, Anne, you started alluding to this a little bit earlier, but I thought I might ask you to just elaborate on it, about whether any of your research gives us some insight into why there's persistent disagreement, or why people might have really different views about privacy that might make it hard to kind of pin down to any one set of interests.
Yeah, so that was one of the reasons, Mark, that Corey and I and Chris and Nate started to look at what drives those differences, right? There's definitely research that shows Americans want more legislation to kind of regulate privacy laws with all the data that everybody's giving out. And so kind of our take is what are those differences? Again, we had age, we had medical experience, we had political party. When we looked at more specifically political party, we drew on a theory known as moral foundation theory. And what moral foundation theory kind of started out to say is, despite differences, big differences in cultures, there seem to be some similar themes when it comes to foundations of morality. And those themes are care, so nurturing, fairness, reciprocal altruism, kind of feelings of justice, loyalty, that's pretty self-explanatory, deference to authority, and purity, sanctity, which is kind of described as abhorrence of things that are disgusting. And liberals and conservatives differ on those. And what we found within that is authority is potentially related to our findings about political parties, such that deference to authority or institutions is higher for conservatives than it is for liberals, which may explain why they are more comfortable in perceiving the ethicality of those statements to be more positive. So, and the reason we want to do that is there are going to be differences. There are differences, right? To ignore those differences would really create an obstacle to try to find some agreement, again, as we look to enhancing our legislation regarding privacy.
All right, so before we switch gears, I wanted to ask you guys about a story that I think Corey and I had a short conversation about the other day, but you might have seen that there was a recent study from Stanford that was on the ability to identify virtual reality users just based on their body motions. So according to the study, well, first of all, the study tested the identifiability of users under sort of typical VR viewing circumstances. So no specially designed identifying behavior, just saying sort of use the VR system. And it found that the researchers were able to identify 95% of the users correctly when trained on less than 5 minutes of tracking data per person. All right, so I wonder, Corey, since you're the one who raised this, I'll ask you first, but Kirsten and Anne, I'm curious about your reactions too. What you make of that as a privacy story. Does it tell us something important about what kinds of information we should have in mind when we think about privacy implications?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with, first of all, the study is fascinating. Not only can they identify who you are, they can identify medical conditions and mental state. And for the record, this is with, the goggles on and 2 things in your hands. This is not even tracking lower body movement or anything like that. So it's as a geeky sort of researcher, it's really unbelievable that they're able to do this. I'll say that the cynics around this are saying, well, this is exactly why the price of the device went down so much from the version 1, is that Facebook is collecting all this information. And by the way, it's Facebook's, their Oculus system that's doing this. So they're looking at this as, let's get it into the hands of as many people as we want or as we can, so that we can collect the data and do something with the data. What that something is the real question here. And is it concerning from a privacy standpoint? I think unambiguously, yes. I mean, this is like entering into your home, into your space where you're playing your games, your kids are playing the games, and they are able to identify who you are, not just that you're a certain type of individual, like age range, race, gender kind of stuff, but actually who you are. And I mean, yes, we have to figure out some way of making people aware of this fact, because I mean, right now it's in the research community that we know about this, but I haven't seen any popular press that's really focused on it that much yet.
Yeah, this is Kirsten. I think it's interesting because it extends an idea that there's a lot more data that we should be considering to be both identifiable and sensitive. I'll just use the term sensitive or intimate. I might use in a non-relationship way, but more of something that tells us something about you that you don't particularly want to be told. And in the United States, we are usually pretty specific. It's like name, birthday, social security number. That's what shows up in policies in companies or regulations. In Europe, they're a little bit more expensive, and we would suggest after location data that you should include location data in that, and something because they can identify who you are pretty easily from your location data. Both that tells you who you are, that we should think of as identifying you as a person, but second, that could give information that might be sensitive or need protection. And in the United States, we are very limited in how we think about both identifying and information that needs protecting. If you think about it, it's health, your video rentals, I mean, like it's really quite financial records. We have certain things around that, but it's fairly limited. And there are other areas that have a more expansive definition of identification and sensitive. And I think that this just exemplifies the fact that we need more focus on data protection that's broader.
Yeah, I would just add to this. This seems relevant, Mark, to your conference tomorrow. I'm sure it's the three of us will be showing up Friday. A week from tomorrow, we have an internal kind of ethics and technology book club. So we're reading the ethical algorithm. And if you kind of want to get freaked out about all the data that's being collected, you may not use VR, so you may not be worried about that. But when you think data is anonymous or being encrypted and you're never going to be found out, the first chapter will potentially tell you that that is not true. So I agree. I think we're really behind because we're not defining data nearly as broadly as we need to be.
Yeah, when I first read that story, and then I was actually talking about it with one of our colleagues, Nitesh Chawla's class yesterday, and asking them, these are all people who are training to be computer scientists. And I was trying to ask them, like, why do you think this technology works? How is it possible that they can just identify you from the way you're moving? It must be the case that they're attaching it to a giant trove of data that they already have about you that they're using. And where are they getting that? Well, if it turns out it's Oculus and it's owned by Facebook, they've got a lot of pictures of you and they've got a lot of other things they can use. So one thing that people I think often underestimate is the way that in this, especially in information economy, the way that new technologies kind of plug into existing data troves and technologies that collect tons of data like that.
Fun fact about that is that you have to have a Facebook account to use the Oculus device now. You didn't used to, you have to now.
Well, yeah, at least until Facebook gets broken up.
I was gonna say, that sounds problematic.
Yeah. All right, so before we switch to Q&A, I wanted to ask a little bit about sort of long-term view, long-term. So I'm gonna ask you to prognosticate a little bit and ask each of you sort of done work in this area. If you look at what we're seeing in today's world, you're seeing a lot of change over time, especially I think since all of us started our careers in terms of data collection, in terms of the privacy implications. So I guess what I'd ask is for each of you for the next few minutes to talk a little bit about sort of what you've seen over the arc of your career, what gives you hope about the future, what gives you the biggest concerns in the sort of short term and the longer term when we think about privacy. Kirsten, I'll start with you.
I would say that the good news since I started thinking or writing about this, say like 20 years ago, that's really a long time. I
didn't put a time on it. I just want to say that for the record.
Well, I'm just outing myself. Is that there's a lot more people talking about it and it's much more mainstream to talk about it, which I think is great because that's more likely to kind of get mainstreamed into commercial endeavors. And so I do think, I used to always say that eventually people will start demanding this in the market, and there'll be different market pressures. And I do think that that is coming around and that people are more aware of it. That doesn't say that the market can actually move some of these big technology companies, but I think that is a good thing, that it's getting more mainstreamed both in our research and in it's not just fringe, philosophers and law that are talking about it anymore. It's a little bit more mainstream than that now. So I think that is all good. The other question was about the future, where I think it's gonna.
What gives you the biggest concern?
Oh, the biggest concern, and this is timely because I just wrote about this, is that my biggest concern are those data aggregators that have no market pressures on them whatsoever. So they have all these third parties, data aggregators. Facebook at least is something identifiable. I think that they're still harmful, but they're identifiable. We know we're dealing with them. They have a lot of oversight over them. There's problems with the way they're building out based on their data, but there are so many more location data aggregators, commercial data aggregators that then have all this information about us pulled in from everywhere, and that it can use it against us in targeting us. And there's no pressure on them whatsoever, right? There's no regulation. They really don't fall very well under the FTC, and we don't have any association with them, so we can't pull our data from them. So I think that trove of sensitive data that's out there, I think, is the thing that gives me the most concern, and where the next wave of focus will come if it comes to regulation.
Great. Anne?
Yeah, so similar to Kirsten, most of my work is more generally in ethics, this being a subset of that. So I can add 5 years to Kirsten and say about 25 years ago, not only were people not thinking about privacy, they didn't think ethics belonged in a business school. So when I would present to business schools, I had one great university say, "It's all really interesting, Anne, but we don't really know how it fits within a business school." Another, again, very good university saying, "Again, this is really interesting, Anne, but what are you going to study when this is no longer a fad?" So just the notion of ethics, and within that, privacy is just becoming a legitimate area of study, which means, as Kirsten said, a lot of people you're getting a lot more eyes looking at it, which I think is what we need. And particularly kind of, Mark, with the work you're doing, kind of interdisciplinary work, because that's exactly where it needs to go. My biggest concern is what I really have already said, and I think we're just behind. We seem to be really slow in addressing these at the policy level, slower than Europe and other places, and it's really time we take it seriously.
Corey?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'll start out with the things that concern me, that I worry that we may not be able to impact, and that's that we are just producers of massive amounts of data. I mean, our phones are just sitting here creating digital exhaust as we're doing nothing. And I made the mistake, this was probably 5 years ago, I was presenting to our advisory board, a group of firms that come in and help us figure out curriculum and stuff. And I said something about, well, digital firms do this. And one of the consulting VPs said, every firm is digital these days, that there's no such thing as a digital firm. Every firm is digital. And he made a really good point that, it doesn't matter what business line you're in, you're creating tons and tons of data, massive amounts, and you have to figure out how to manage that data. So the mere fact that there's so much out there, that gives me some pause. But I do want to take maybe a step back and really quickly say, I think that there's a way, I truly believe there's a way to study this thing in a really responsible way. I'll just briefly talk about a couple of the projects that are underway at Notre Dame, but we are studying students, faculty, and staff that have wearable devices that have opted into studies that we're conducting. And the goal there is, it varies, but we're trying to better understand how work, stress, screen time, and your health and sleep are all related. And, the best way that we can do that is through instrumenting you. And I know that sounds a little scary and cyborgish, but the devices that we have on our wrists, as I do here, give us a lot of information. And there are proper protocols that we have in place at the university that ensure that we're doing it in a respectful way that allows people to opt in and opt out as they wish. So I don't want anyone to walk away from this panel discussion thinking that we should just stop researching. That's not the goal of any of us here. And I would contend that the others feel the same about this. We have to just figure out responsible ways to do it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And also responsible ways to think about what happens to the data after you've collected it and studied it, right? And so many of the problems, especially on the legal side, come from the fact that people sort of collect data, figure out what to do with it later, and just sort of hang on to it on the theory that it might turn out to be useful later on. And we get lots of problems from that. So, okay, so I'm going to shift. We've got some really good questions that have come in. So I'm going to shift to them. One is a sort of general question, which I think resonates with some of what we talked about, but I want to ask it, which is basically, Kirsten, I'll direct this one to you because I think it sort of fits some of your research. But the question is basically whether we sometimes let our guard down when there is something like a pandemic going on, and we think, and maybe you could say that this happened in some respects after 9/11 also. So you see an external threat, people sort of agree to more things that they might otherwise have thought of as privacy violations, and they sort of give away more information. And then maybe we sort of learn to regret it, and there's like hard to put the genie back in the bottle. So do you have concerns about that in the time of COVID, that right now we're sort of needing to collect more data to collect it, and then does that open the door to continue to collecting, for people continuing to collect it later when the pandemic risk is gone?
Yeah, I mean, I think 9/11 is a good, with the Patriot Act, and a good example of how we expanded the type of information that was being gathered. And then, although I have to say at the time, there were people that were complaining about it, right? And we're like, you need to put a sunset on this, you need to understand what you're going to do with the data. But you're right, when the threat was gone, then they said, well, what are you doing with our data? I think in general, though, it's a good example of, just because we disclose data doesn't mean that we don't have strong privacy expectations as to what happens to that data. And the biggest mistake companies or government entities make, although government not as much, because they usually have laws as to what they can do with the data. So they understand that there are rules as to what they can do with the either gathered data. But just because people allow, for example, when they go into a bar, if they have to write down that they were there with their phone number for contact tracing, it doesn't mean that anything goes with that data. It doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all with that data. Even if it's around COVID, we all have expectations of privacy as to what happens with that data, even after it's been disclosed. And so one of the problems might be that more people get access to more data that aren't used to thinking about it. So, restaurants are gathering your health information in some ways, your contact information that they think that they can use however they want. But the fact is that we all have price expectations around it. I don't actually think that it changes, our price expectations don't change as to whether or not we disclose the data, whether the pandemic is happening or not. The problem is what you described, which is a bunch of companies or government actors get a hold of some data. They realize they still have it a year from now when the pandemic is hopefully under control. And then they're like, well, what else can we do with this data? You know what I mean? Like, so we can actually do something else with it, which is in some ways what was happening after 9/11 as well. They were still gathering the data and they were using it for alternative purposes, not necessarily for foreign actors. So I think that's the bigger concern I have, that the people that gathered the data do something weird with it in a year, rather than we change our expectations, if that makes sense.
And I wondered if I could see if you had any thoughts on that too, because I think it reminded me a little bit of the answer you were giving earlier about sort of when people thought there was an external threat, it did actually change kind of the way they answered. So do you think there's some risk here?
Yeah, so I think that the risk is we're all good now, right? Because your focus is mitigating the pandemic. But the question is how will I feel about it in 2 years? I was actually just thinking more local, for those of us that have been in the classroom this fall, you suddenly would have people not showing up to your class because they said, well, I have a red pass or a yellow pass. Well, we didn't have that information. So you had no way to tell whether or not you just chose not to come to class, right? Or whether you truly were either in contact tracing and or had COVID or at risk for COVID. That has started to change. And I didn't think we were going to get there in August when this issue was discussed. So I think you can see it even just within our own community, that people have relaxed because of the need for that information to determine whether people are legitimately on Zoom or whether they should be showing up in your classroom.
Okay, so Corey, I'll start with you on the next one, although I think maybe all of you will have something to say about this. So somebody asked, whether, so I'll ask this kind of in the form of the study you're doing with Anne about the privacy statements in the context of medical care, but the question is posed a little more generally, which is basically, are there studies that show that one of the reasons people just sort of sign these things and don't trust them is because they don't really believe that companies are going to abide by them anyway, right? So they think it's just a ticket to get in to see the doctor. They're not relying on them because they don't have any expectation that the other side is relying on them. Do you think, I mean, if that were true, that would sort of be a truly wasteful system, right? And maybe even engendering lack of trust. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I should start by saying I'm not convinced it isn't a wasteful system. It just seems to, I mean, they most admitting hospitals and doctors' office have someone that staffs that function all day long. That is literally making sure that someone signed their NPP, their notice of privacy practices. And here's a secret for you. If you actually do read those documents, at the very bottom, it says, it does not say, I agree to these terms. It says, I have been presented with this information. And we've done enough interviews to realize that the medical admittance people, their pushback when somebody says, I don't want to sign this document, they say, well, all you're doing is signing that you saw it. And you did see it because I watched you, I handed it to you and it looked like you were looking at it. So you saw it. But beyond the semantics of it, I think it becomes incredibly difficult. I mean, in the healthcare system, something I know pretty well, hospitals are really, their hands are tied if you say, I do not want my data digitized. Their systems are entirely run on electronic medical records in all the hospitals now. If you don't have a medical electronic record, you can't be treated effectively. So it wouldn't surprise me at all that some hospitals are turning people away, saying, if you do not allow your information to be in an electronic system, we can't treat you effectively, and therefore we can't treat you. So, I mean, there are so many, I mean, there's so many layers of what privacy actually is, and so many challenges that we have related to how people interpret it. I mean, to this question, it's a good one. Is it because we don't actually trust the entity on the behind the scenes on this? And I think there's an element of that there, but I think there's also just this black box of, even if you are in the know, even technologists out there, they too don't quite understand all of the different places that data can be routed. Some legitimate, some not, less legitimate, and some entirely illegitimate. So, I mean, I would put myself in the category of knowing this space pretty well, but even I wouldn't have a clue who is ultimately ending up with my data.
Yeah, I would add to that, Corey, going back to our interviews that we did, the institution, if we think of the healthcare institution, two themes we saw pretty consistently in those interviews. One is when you ask the healthcare institutions themselves, do you think these are ethical? They always defer to HIPAA. Well, HIPAA allows it. So it's no even kind of, we don't even want to go to the ethicality of it. And the other probably more interesting question that we'd ask is, well, who owns the data? And there was just no one. By their answers, no one. They didn't want to say they own the data. That was clear. But they also knew the patient really didn't own the data. And so there's, again, kind of an introduction of ambiguity, as well as this kind of moral disengagement mechanism of displacement of responsibility to HIPAA.
I think the questioner probably doesn't trust the companies that are, from the wording of the question, doesn't trust the companies. And we do find that whether or not you trust the institution of going online, or your hospital, or the company that you're engaging with, ESPN as a website, the Washington Post, that is a bigger driver if you have concerns about privacy than anything else. And so when we say whether or not someone's concerned about privacy, what they're really saying is whether or not they trust the entity on the other side. Because you could have low concern about privacy, have really high price expectations, like expect them never to share the data and actually delete it after a day. I'm just making this up. But you trust the company, and so you have low concerns. You know what I mean? Like, so what, and that's what we find. And you can almost split people into groups of like quartiles of super high trusting people, middle trusting people, low middle, and then really not trusting at all. And there's dispositional scales on this, and even whether or not you trust hospitals or whether you trust different institutions. And that is the biggest driver as to whether or not you trust the other side. That's what's driving whether people click through and go to ESPN or use an ad blocker or track blocker or something like that. So, and they actually totally separately, although in the medical realm, there was an article in the Journal of Science on this, where the consent form to like have surgery at the hospital, how meaningless those things are, because it's pretty much saying, like, I just did this for my daughter, I'm going to let you get her ACL repaired. I'm not dictating exactly what happens when the doctor's in there and figuring things out. I just trust that they're going to take care of her. And I trust that they're not going to do anything weird to her while she's back there, and that he's going to actually fix the correct knee. So there's all these like trusting expectations that go into the signing it. And privacy is really not that different. And so for this questioner, and I would agree, I don't know what it matters what they say in the notice, because I think they're going to do with my data whatever they were planning to do anyway. But that has to do a lot with whether or not you trust. And some people trust a lot.
Yeah, all those answers are actually all really dumb. There's a couple of questions that came in that were basically about whether we have empirical measurements of the extent to which people understand what actually is happening with their data. And so maybe the answer, and one of the reasons why trust turns out to be determinative, is that like, it's impossible to know, as Corey was saying, in this world, what's happening with all your data. Even for all of us who pay a lot of attention to this, it's just impossible to know. And so trust just becomes the way to cut through that and just say, like, this lets me not have to know, right? Because I trust that enough of what I care about is going to be respected by this entity.
If anyone's ever interested in, like, there's a lot of research at Carnegie Mellon around whether or not people understand privacy notices. And Lori Craner is a professor of computer science there. And then there's Jason Hong is there that does like a privacy grade about whether or not notices do what they say they're going to do. But they've done measurements around financial privacy notices and ad notices and all sorts of things about what people actually understand. And Carnegie Mellon's a great place for that specific measurement.
So we've got just a few minutes left. There's a cluster of questions that came in, which are basically like, what do we do about this? And so all of you guys mentioned at various points, we're behind, we really need better regulation here. We need to sort of do more about data protection. So one question is, like, if there were one particular thing that you think would really help from a regulatory perspective, what would it be? And maybe relatedly, do any of you have views on whether Europe is in a better situation than we are with GDPR in place in this respect?
Maybe I'll kick that off. Prior to doing the study that I'm working on with Anne, I would have said absolutely GDPR, the European privacy standard, is far ahead of where we are. But interestingly, going back to something we said earlier, is that we actually tested the GDPR statements, the ones that are recommended by the EU and the ones that they put up as examples of these are bad, you should not do this, you should not state it this way. And the ones that were rated as good were very, very specific about what you can and can't do. And those were rated less ethically by our sample of people. Now, what that says to me, I mean, it's to Kirsten's point from earlier on too, is that when you get too specific about this, it starts freaking people out. That's technical language, or freaking people out. And, but when they were general about it, which they say is bad, people were like, I'm okay with this because I, in a sense, trust that they're going to do the right thing with my data. So until we can kind of get over that hump and actually just figure out how do you word things to engender trust in people, I don't know that doing something like GDPR is going to fix it. In fact, it could have the opposite effect.
But I would say, I agree. I think it's important to distinguish, do I trust and am I motivated to trust, right? Is my trust accurate, or is it just because I want to trust and therefore I'm trying to, I'm maybe not discerning as much as I should in terms of where I stand on this issue. But at least I would say about Europe is they've at least started to have the conversations. Whether they made a mistake in the way that they go, and my point is, what should we do? we got to start talking about it, and we can't let differences freak us out, that some people are going to see this as no problem, and other sides are not going to share that viewpoint. But you at least have to begin to have those conversations. I was in Munich a couple of years ago for a presentation on ethics, and my host was someone who was part of a committee to come up with regulations for autonomous vehicles. And so they had ethicists, and they had insurance companies, and they had auto companies, and they at least develop a set of 10 principles so that this notion of is this right or not wasn't going to stall them so much that it would stop production of those types of vehicles, because there was all this disagreement. So I think we need to embrace the disagreements and just set about to engage in policy that's going to make some sense from all perspectives.
I think GDPR. I mean, we're in the we're talking about health, and I mentioned financial records and video. Those are like the few cases where we focus on the data and not so much on the consumer. And I'm not the first to notice this. I mean, or say this, but it's very data focused. They protect the data over in Europe and everything's about a data protection officer, data integrity. So everything is focused on the data. In the United States, we're very consumer market focused. So and that's why we regulate the actual handoff of information as if it's a simple transaction, almost like it's a bad product. We focus on that immediate transaction when most of the work around data is actually done by these third parties. So I think if anything, as we at the state level start shifting more towards the actual data that's being gathered and housed, and start looking at, in California, or I think it was Minnesota, they did facial recognition. So, or Wisconsin, I'm going to confuse the two, but one of the upper Midwest states did facial recognition, and I'm forgetting which. It might be Wisconsin. But the more that we focus on the data, I think the better off we are, because our mechanisms for dealing with consumer firm relationships are limited. And when it's something that once the company gets the data, they can do whatever they want with it. So I think that the more we focus on data like the GDPR, the better off we're going to be here in the United States.
Yeah, one of the lessons I take away from the discussion of all of your work today too is that I think we're very much on the wrong track by trying to get people to disclose more and get more in the way of notice. And that really what we need to do is promote trustworthy behavior and try to get people to be interacting with intermediaries who are acting in a trustworthy way, not just ask people to sign off on what they're doing, right? And so maybe thinking of it more as a fiduciary model is maybe the way to go. So, okay, so we promised people we'd end at 2. So now it's my job just to thank all of you guys for joining us today. We want to particularly thank all of our panelists and the ThinkND team from the Alumni Association for hosting the series. As I said earlier, next week we'll return for the national viewpoint, and we're going to have a great panel joining us of folks from government, from industry, including Christina Montgomery, who's Chief Privacy Officer at IBM, Santiago Garces, who was recently in the city government in Pittsburgh and just moved back to South Bend, Ryan Harkins from Microsoft, Ryan Blaney from law firm Proskauer, and Christine Bannon, who's a former student of mine who's been working in public policy in privacy since she graduated. So please feel free to share this series with your friends. We're accepting registrations through the end of through the entire program, as each meeting can stand alone. In addition, please do join us for the Tech Ethics Conference that's tomorrow from noon to 3. We promise that there's going to be an engaging lineup of speakers there, just like today, and the opportunity to hear from Kathy O'Neill, who's our keynote and the best-selling author of the book called Weapons of Math Destruction. Please keep in mind that we'll be live streaming the conference, so you don't need to join the entire event, and just know that you can come and go as your schedule allows. We hope to have you there. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks to all of you guys on the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys.